Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something you probably have some experience with. Flies.
Uh,
But
yeah.
I promise this is going to be fascinating.
Yeah, intrigued.
You probably only think of flies as pests, but there's so much more to them. We are going to be talking about all different kinds of flies. Blowflies, house flies, fruit flies.
Oh, I hate those little fruit flies.
We will also be discussing face flies, cluster flies, and even those little fungus gnats. We are going to go beyond the swatting and really try to understand these fascinating creatures.
I never thought I would describe flies as fascinating.
Mm.
But okay, I'm ready to learn.
Well, let's start with the basics. What makes a fly a fly?
Right, so all true flies belong to the order Diptera,
Which means?
2 wings.
Okay.
Unlike other insects that have 4 wings, flies only have 1 pair for flying.
So what happened to the other pair?
Well, they have evolved into these tiny little club-shaped structures called halters, which act like gyroscopes.
Like built-in stabilizers.
Exactly. They help flies maintain balance and perform those crazy aerial maneuvers.
That's how they make those super quick turns and changes in direction.
Yep, that's thanks to the halters.
Wow, that's pretty cool. Is there anything else that really sets flies apart?
Well, their life cycle is incredibly fast.
Really? How fast are we talking?
Many species can go from egg to adult in as little as 7 to 14 days. And on top of that, they can produce multiple generations in just a single season.
So that explains why it seems like there are always so many of them. But why is this rapid life cycle so important? Like, what does it really mean for them?
It's actually a key factor in their success. Flies have evolved to thrive in just about every environment on Earth, and this rapid reproduction allows them to adapt quickly to any changes, take advantage of fleeting food sources.
Which probably appear and disappear quickly.
Right. Plus, it also allows them to evolve resistance to insecticides.
Which makes controlling them quite a challenge.
Yeah, you could say that.
Speaking of challenges, let's talk about the less glamorous side of flies.
You mean all the filth and disease?
Yeah, like those blowflies. I always think they're kind of beautiful.
With those metallic colors, yeah.
But they aren't exactly known for having a refined palate.
No, not at all. Blowflies are actually also called carrion flies because they are attracted to things like, well,
Like what? Don't leave me hanging.
things like decaying carcasses and animal feces.
And they use these substances as breeding grounds
Yep.
for their larvae.
You mean those squirming maggots?
Oh gosh, yes.
Have you ever heard of those blowfly maggots being found just wandering around inside homes?
No, I haven't.
Apparently, they can wander quite far from their original breeding site, which might be something like, oh, I don't know, the carcass of a dead rodent or a bird.
Oh, okay. So that's both fascinating and kind of disturbing. It makes you realize there might be more going on behind the scenes than we think. Now, what about houseflies?
Oh, houseflies. They're practically everywhere humans are.
It seems like they really enjoy our company.
You could say they have a closer relationship with us than we might like to think.
And with all that time they spend around us, they must pick up some nasty stuff along the way, right?
Exactly. Houseflies are a major spreader of disease.
How? They don't bite, do they?
No, they spread disease mechanically. So their legs and bodies can become contaminated with pathogens from all the things they land on and feed on, and then, of course, they land on our food and our surfaces.
Spreading all that nasty stuff.
Right. They can spread diseases like cholera, dysentery, typhoid,
Oh my gosh.
and even parasitic worms.
That is definitely some good motivation to keep things clean. It's not just houseflies, though, right? We also have those annoying face flies buzzing around.
Right. Faceflies are similar to houseflies, but they seem to prefer.
Cattle and horses?
Yes. They feed on secretions around the animal's eyes, noses, and mouths, which can transmit diseases like pink eye.
That's just awful.
But guess what? They also overwinter in our homes, just like cluster flies.
So we can add them to the list of unwanted house guests. But before we get to cluster flies, let's talk about another one. Fruit flies. These little guys might seem harmless, but their impact on agriculture is actually pretty significant.
That's right. Fruit flies are incredibly tiny, like only about 3 millimeters long,
Wow, that is tiny.
but they're a major agricultural pest, especially for fruit crops. Their larvae burrow into fruits and other plant parts.
So they actually cause damage.
Yeah, causing damage and making the produce unmarketable.
I always just picture them hovering over my ripe bananas or lingering around leftover drinks.
Well, that's where they thrive. It's that attraction to fermenting fruits that makes them so challenging to control. But there is a bright side. One species of fruit fly, the common fruit fly, or Drosophila melanogaster,
Okay.
has actually been incredibly beneficial to science.
Oh, I've heard about that. They are used in genetic research, right?
Yes, Drosophila melanogaster has a short lifespan and reproduces quickly.
Sounds familiar.
Right. So it makes it a really great model organism for studying genetics.
I see.
Actually, research on fruit flies has led to some groundbreaking discoveries,
Yeah.
like identifying genes that control development.
Wow.
And they've even helped us understand human diseases.
So these tiny flies have helped us unlock some of the mysteries of human health.
It's true. And they have also played a crucial role in developing something called the sterile male technique,
Which is?
the technique for insect control. Basically, scientists use radiation to induce mutations in male flies, making them sterile.
Oh, okay.
Then these sterile males are released into the wild to compete with wild males for mates.
So they can't produce offspring.
Exactly. And that reduces the overall population size.
So we are essentially outsmarting them with their own biology. It's like fighting fire, but with flies.
Exactly. It's like a great example of how understanding flies can help us come up with innovative solutions for managing their populations.
Okay, so we've covered those disease-carrying flies and the agricultural pests. Now let's move on to those flies that love to spend their winters in our homes. Let's start with those awkward flyers, the cluster flies. I always feel like they are bumping into things.
Yes, cluster flies are pretty distinctive. They are larger and darker than houseflies, with the checkered black and silver abdomen. And you're right, they aren't exactly graceful flyers, especially when they're indoors in that semi-dormant state.
Why do you think they choose to overwinter in our homes?
Well, unlike those houseflies and blowflies, cluster flies have a rather unusual life cycle. Their larvae are actually parasites of earthworms.
Oh, interesting.
They lay their eggs in the soil near earthworm burrows.
And then the maggots feed on the earthworms.
Gross, right. And then as fall approaches, the adult flies start to look for a warm place to spend the winter.
Which ends up being our warm homes.
Unfortunately for us, yes.
So at least they aren't as interested in our food and garbage, right?
Not really. So luckily, they aren't considered a health hazard like some other flies.
They're mostly just a nuisance.
Exactly. Primarily because of their sheer numbers and their tendency to congregate in large clusters.
Which is how they got their name.
Makes sense.
Well, that's a relief. It's bad enough having them buzzing around without having to worry about diseases. Now, speaking of uninvited house guests, we can't forget about those tiny dark flies that love to hang out around our windows. Fungus gnats. I always seem to find them in my plant room, especially in the winter.
That makes sense because fungus gnats are attracted to damp soil, so they are often found around overwatered houseplants. They breed in the potting mix.
And what do they eat?
They feed on decaying organic matter and fungi.
So they are basically harmless to both plants and humans.
Yes, they are mostly just a nuisance. They don't bite or spread diseases.
They don't really damage plants,
No, they're just annoying.
especially when they start swarming around your face.
Right.
So we have learned about all these different types of flies, their habits, and their impact. But what can we actually do about them? How do we keep these buzzing bandits at bay?
Well, luckily, there's some effective ways to control fly populations. It all starts with understanding their life cycles
Yeah.
and what attracts them. We've got three main methods: sanitation, exclusion,
Got it.
and then, as a last resort,
Yeah.
insecticides.
Let's start with sanitation. I have a feeling this is going to involve some good old-fashioned cleaning.
It is. Sanitation is the foundation for fly control.
Yeah.
Remember, flies love filth and decaying matter, so getting rid of these breeding sites is key to keeping populations down.
So that means taking out the garbage regularly, cleaning up spilled food, and keeping compost piles well maintained.
Exactly. Basically, just deny them their buffet of, let's just say, less than appetizing snacks.
What about exclusion? How do we keep them from getting into our homes in the first place?
Well, exclusion is all about creating barriers, so think screens on windows and doors,
Oh, yeah.
caulking cracks and
I
crevices,
need to do that.
and making sure that vents and other openings are properly sealed. It's especially important to be proactive about exclusion in the late summer and early fall.
When it starts to get cold.
Yes, that's when flies, like cluster flies and face flies, are looking for warm places to overwinter.
So it's all about fly-proofing your home.
You got it.
And what about insecticides? Are they always necessary?
Well, ideally, we want to minimize insecticide use whenever possible.
So when should we use them?
They should be considered a supplemental approach, like when sanitation and exclusion just aren't fully effective. It's also important to note that many fly populations have actually developed resistance to insecticides,
Oh, wow.
so they aren't as effective as they used to be.
So if you have to use insecticides, what's the best approach?
Choose targeted applications, such as bait stations or traps, rather than widespread spraying.
That makes sense. Are there any other options for controlling flies? Besides insecticides, I mean.
Sure, there are those old-fashioned mechanical traps.
Like fly paper,
Yeah, those sticky ribbons can be helpful. There are also electrocution traps.
which I'm not a fan of, but
I get it. And then there are also various food-based traps that lure flies into a container they can't escape.
it seems like there are a lot of options out there. But the best approach is a combination of strategies, right?
Definitely. Starting with good sanitation practices.
Prevention is key. But don't forget, flies are more than just pests. They actually play a vital role in the ecosystem.
That's a great point. We'll talk more about that when we come back. It's easy to focus on all the negative stuff, but we can't forget that flies play some pretty important roles in the ecosystem too.
You're right. We have talked a lot about the downsides, but let's talk about the ecological importance of flies. What purpose do they actually serve?
Well, they are incredibly important decomposers.
Okay.
Remember those blow flies we talked about earlier?
Mhm.
The ones that are attracted to decaying matter?
Yeah.
Well, they play a vital role in breaking down carcasses and all that other organic waste, basically recycling those nutrients right back into the ecosystem.
So they are like nature's cleanup crew.
Exactly.
And blowflies aren't the only ones, are they?
No, lots of fly species contribute to decomposition. Even those fruit flies we consider pests, they're actually helping to break down fallen fruit and other plant material.
So maybe I should stop judging them so harshly when they're all over my bananas. What other ecological benefits are there?
Well, believe it or not, flies are also important pollinators.
Really?
Yeah,
I usually think of bees and butterflies as being the big pollinators.
right. They're much more efficient, but flies still visit flowers and transfer pollen, which helps a lot of plant species to reproduce.
Interesting. I mean, they are always buzzing around, so I guess it makes sense that they would pick up some pollen along the way.
Exactly. And their role in pollination is actually super important in certain ecosystems like forests and grasslands, where they pollinate a lot of the wildflowers and other plants that might not be as attractive to those other pollinators.
So they help maintain biodiversity.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Any other ecological roles we should know about?
Well, we can't forget that flies are an important food source for lots of other animals.
Like what?
Birds, bats, reptiles, amphibians, and even other insects. They all rely on flies as a really good source of protein,
So they are a pretty key part of the food chain.
a very key part, supporting all those different kinds of predators.
It's crazy to think that something we consider a pest is actually essential for so many other creatures.
It really just goes to show how interconnected nature really is.
And it proves that even the creatures we find annoying have a place and purpose in the world. Okay, so we've covered the good, the bad, and the slightly smelly.
I like that.
But given how quickly flies evolve and adapt, what kind of impact could they have on our lives in the future?
That is a great question, and it's actually something that scientists are currently studying. One area of concern is disease transmission.
Makes sense.
As the climate warms, there is a chance that fly populations could expand, and we could see more fly-borne diseases, especially in those regions where there isn't much sanitation and healthcare infrastructure.
So climate change could make the problem of flies worse.
It's definitely a possibility. And another concern is that flies could develop resistance to even more insecticides.
Making them even harder to control.
Unfortunately, yes.
But surely there could be some potential benefits from flies in the future.
Actually, there are some promising areas of research. Scientists are currently exploring the use of fly larvae for bioremediation.
Fly larvae.
You mean maggots.
Oh, okay.
They are incredibly efficient at breaking down organic waste,
So I've heard.
so they could potentially be used to clean up contaminated soil and even process food waste.
So we could use the power of maggots to help solve some of our environmental problems.
Exactly. Another area of research is using flies for biocontrol, basically pitting flies against other pests.
It's like that sterile male technique we talked about, using their biology to our advantage.
Right. Certain fly species are natural predators of other insects, and scientists are trying to figure out how to use these predatory flies to control those agricultural pests.
So we could reduce our reliance on chemical pesticides. That is really cool. It's amazing how something that can be so annoying can also be so helpful. Speaking of helpful, let's go back to that bioremediation with maggots. That sounds a bit unconventional.
I mean, it might sound off-putting, but it is a very promising area of research. Remember, maggots are those master decomposers.
Right.
They have those voracious appetites and super efficient digestive systems.
Yeah.
They can break down organic matter incredibly quickly.
So how would that work in practice? Would we just release swarms of maggots into contaminated area?
Well, it's not quite that dramatic. Maggot therapy is already being used in medicine to clean wounds and remove dead tissue.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so the maggots are sterilized and carefully applied to the wound, and they basically just eat away at the dead tissues.
So they are like tiny little surgeons. What about environmental cleanup?
Well, that's where things get interesting. Scientists are figuring out how to use maggots to remediate soil that has been contaminated, especially soil polluted with things like heavy metals and other toxic substances.
So the maggots would eat that contaminated soil.
Yes. And then their digestive systems would help break down and detoxify some of those pollutants.
So they really are like tiny little filters.
Exactly. And because they're so efficient at breaking down organic matter, they could also be used to process food waste.
Which could then be turned into compost or biofuel.
Exactly.
It's amazing how something we think of as a nuisance could be a key to a more sustainable future.
It's all about perspective. Flies might not be the most glamorous, but they're full of surprises.
Well said. We have covered a lot today. Their anatomy, their life cycles, their ecological roles, and their potential for the future. Any final thoughts for our listeners?
Yeah, next time you see a fly, try not to just swat it away. Take a moment to observe it and think about its incredible adaptations and its place in the world. You might find a newfound respect for these creatures.
I agree. It's amazing how something so small can open up such a big world of knowledge and wonder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the fascinating world of flies. It's amazing to think how much we've learned about flies. I mean, at first I thought this was going to be a pretty simple topic.
Right.
But they are so complex.
They really are.
And fascinating.
Yeah.
It's like they are these little ambassadors from another world,
That's a great way to put it.
revealing secrets about nature and evolution.
And our own future.
Speaking of learning, you mentioned earlier that flies, especially fruit flies, have been incredibly helpful in genetic research.
Oh, yeah.
What kind of discoveries have they helped us make?
Oh, my gosh, so many. Fruit fly has been so important for geneticists.
Especially that Drosophila melanogaster.
It's like their Rosetta Stone. Their short lifespans and their fast reproduction rates allow scientists to study lots of generations in a short amount of time.
So they are like little time machines for genetic research.
Exactly. And the discoveries have been amazing. For example, they've been essential in identifying genes that control embryonic development.
Wow.
And they've helped us understand how genes regulate cell division, which is really important for cancer research.
That's incredible.
And even more than that, research on fruit flies has shed light on the genetic basis of some human diseases,
Like what?
like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's.
Wow. So these tiny flies buzzing around my fruit bowl could hold the key to understanding those diseases.
It's true. And beyond the lab, fruit flies have also been crucial in developing innovative pest control methods.
Like that sterile male technique we talked about.
Exactly. Scientists can basically induce mutations in male flies,
Making them sterile
and then they release them into the wild to compete with the wild males.
so they can't produce offspring.
Exactly. It disrupts the breeding cycle and controls the population.
So clever. It seems like flies can offer solutions to some of our biggest challenges.
They really can.
And it's not just about controlling pests,
Right. We also talked about using fly larvae for bioremediation.
which is using what? Maggots?
Yes, maggots. It might sound a little unconventional,
Okay.
but it is a really promising area of research.
Yeah.
Maggots are those master decomposers.
I've heard.
They can break down organic matter so quickly.
Amazing.
So how are we using this power for bioremediation?
What are some of the practical applications?
Well, one is in medicine. It's called maggot therapy, and it's been around for centuries.
Wow, really?
But it's gaining interest again now. Basically, sterilized maggots are applied to wounds and ulcers.
And what do they do?
They feed on the dead and infected tissue, which cleans the wound and helps it heal.
So they're tiny little surgeons.
That's one way to think about it. Scientists are also looking at using them for larger-scale environmental cleanup projects.
Such as?
Well, imagine using them to clean up soil that's been contaminated with heavy metals or other toxins.
So they would eat the contaminated soil?
They would. And their digestive systems would help break down and detoxify some of those pollutants.
It's like they are tiny little filters cleaning up the environment.
Exactly. And because they are so good at breaking down organic matter, we could even use them for waste management.
Like processing food waste and turning it into compost or biofuel?
Exactly.
Wow, it's incredible to think that something we consider a nuisance could actually help create a more sustainable future.
It really is. It's all about perspective.
Well said. I think we've covered just about everything there is to know about flies. Their anatomy, their life cycles, their ecological roles, and their potential for the future.
I think so.
Any final thoughts you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I would just say, the next time you see a fly, don't immediately swat it away.
Yeah,
Take a moment to observe it, appreciate how incredibly adapted it is, and think about its place in this complex world.
I completely agree. It's amazing how something so small can teach us so much about our world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of flies.